We're here tonight to honor another person, Dr. Isaac Asimov, who is, of course, the Renaissance man of the 20th century, author, lecturer, scientist, philosopher. He is the author of over 270 books. The exact number I don't know since I did not visit the bookstore this morning. Innumerable articles and short stories. Although the majority of the public may know of his writings in the field of science fiction, he is also well known for his efforts in science, scientific speculation, history, religion, biography, and literature. Dr. Asimov began writing science fiction in early life. His first story was published during his high school days. He was awarded degrees in biochemistry from Columbia University and taught at Boston University Medical School, where he became known among the students for the unique quality of his lectures. In his writings of all kinds, Dr. Asimov is the exponent of logical scientific thought processes. When he speculates on future scientific breakthroughs, such speculation is always founded on known scientific principles. Thus, he has become a representative of the scientific evolutionary point of view in media interviews concerning the current controversy of teaching creationism in the public schools as a matter of fairness. Yet Dr. Asimov retains always a sense of humor about any such controversy, explaining the scientific point of view in a reasonable fashion without the alienation which many times occurs when emotionalism intrudes. Asimov's Guide to the Bible is a perfect example of his ability to place religious principles in an historical perspective, removing any reliance on the occult to explain the occurrences within the frameworks of the times and the culture for which the book was written. Yet he does so in such a fashion that it would be difficult for anyone to take umbrage at his guide. In other areas, Asimov's Guide to Shakespeare is a wonderful study of the plays from mythology, historical background, relevance to the audiences of the day, and sources. His humor becomes unbounded in his limericks, several volumes of which have been published. His history of the United States, his biography of scientists, further exhibit the range of interests of this eclectic humanist of the year. His self-deprecating sense of humor is illustrated in an anecdote he tells about having written a science fiction stories in the 1940s. In this story, he had a hero take out of his pocket a rectangular box, press some buttons, and look at the results of the calculation in red numbers at the top of the instrument. Many years later, he was asked why he did not patent the idea. He explained that he only described the outside of the box. When his accomplishments in various fields are admired, his stock answer is, quote, "I am only a lucky beneficiary in the genetic sweepstakes," unquote. However, Dr. Asimov is an inspiration to all of us to make the best use of whatever innate talents each of us happens to have received in those same sweepstakes. Dr. Asimov is a signer of the Human Manifesto 2 and follows humanistic principles in his lectures and his writing. He constantly demands that his audience think critically in scientific terms about societal problems. He has served on a committee for the scientific investigation of the claims of the paranormal since its foundation by the American Humanist Association in 1976. Further development of that committee has led to the publication of the journal The Skeptical Inquirer, of which Dr. Asimov is a consulting editor. In science, whether the subject is quasars, black holes, evolution versus creationism, overpopulation, he is always ready to explain in very lucid terms the difference between science and mysticism. He is greatly concerned about the scientific illiteracy among our population and the rise of pseudoscience and cults. For all of the above and for a lifetime devoted to the enhancement of life based on humanistic principles, the American Humanist Association is proud to name its 1984 Humanist of the Year, Dr. Isaac Asimov. The plaque says, for his lifetime contributions to the advancement of humanism by conveying humanist principles to millions through his prodigious literary and scientific works. Dr. Isaac Asimov.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I sometimes wondered why I didn't get this before. But I realize now they were waiting for 1984. As a matter of fact, well, it's right here. I think the general subject is what is the title of the... Big Brother is Watching You, right. And I have a little story to tell about what happened when I was teaching at Boston University School of Medicine. There was a time when I drove in from Newton along a deserted river road. And I noticed that when I passed it at night, it was lined up by automobiles, just like that, one after the other, and there are no houses in sight. And there were no sports events taking place. There was nothing doing. So I came to work one day, I said, why are there so many cars parked on such and such a highway? And everyone laughed. I mean, I didn't realize it was a lover's lane. Never occurred to me. Whereupon, one young lady said that an innocent amusement she sometimes engaged in was to drive with her boyfriend along that stretch of road, lean out of the window of the car and shout, "God sees you!" and imagining the wave of detumescence that proceeded. But I sat and thought that finally we had the ultimate Big Brother. He is watching. Everyone says so. He's watching you all day. He's watching you all night. He knows everything you do. In fact, he knows everything you think. And what makes this so wonderful when in general we object to Big Brother watching? And so then I thought, well, how can we defeat Big Brother? Is there any way in which we can prevent his doing what he's doing? Because, of course, the orthodox view is that he is responsible for everything. You want to know why the dinosaurs grew extinct, assuming they existed in the first place? Well, the dinosaurs are not mentioned in the Bible. Well, they went extinct because that's what God decided to do. And if we find any materialistic reason for the extinction, that's just the method God happened to use. He could have just waved his hand and said, let them be extinct. But if he decides to use a cometary impact, his ways are not our ways, and we have no right to object to them. And of course, any disaster that takes place, short of a cometary impact, is also his plan. If an epidemic hits a region and kills half the people in it, you simply must accept that. If war strikes, if an invading army comes in, slaying and raping and murdering, as part of the plan too. And no doubt everything is for the best. And you can always console yourself with a thought that it's not necessarily the result of your personal sin if you're killed in an epidemic or a military invasion, because these are wholesale signs of God's wrath. And in his fury, his justified fury, it may be that a few people who don't really deserve it get it in the neck too. And you can tell yourself, if that happens, that you're one of the relatively few who don't deserve it, and you'll be going to heaven anyway. But there is one catastrophe which nobody can argue about. No one can say it's the result of chance, that you had the bad luck to be caught with a bunch of sinners, and God didn't have time to single you out for condign mercy, or anything of the sort. And that's the lightning bolt. If ever there was anything which is clearly God's artillery, it's lightning. It just doesn't strike wholesale, it's aimed. And no matter how much the sweep of the scythe may catch all sorts of people, that little pinpoint lightning is aimed right at the guy it hits. and it goes beyond the bounds of possibility that God will miss his aim and say, oops. Therefore, lightning is particularly feared. It's a source of posthumous embarrassment. I mean, you know, not only that you're a sinner, maybe you know, everyone else is going to know that you're an egregious sinner. I mean, God took the trouble of pinpointing you. Well then, it's an odd thing that of all the catastrophes that can befall human beings, the first one to be defeated was the lightning bolt. It came before anyone learned how to prevent epidemics, before anyone learned how to prevent famines, before anyone learned how to make rain if they wanted to, or do any of the things which ameliorate some of the miseries of human life. And it was all the fault of our own Benjamin Franklin back in 1752. This was a time when everybody was fooling around with static electricity. Static electricity was the excitement of the time. By the way, before I go on, I better ask, how long do you want me to talk, by the way? As long as I wish. You know, I've never had any other answer than that. I was thinking of writing a sign, as long as you wish, and hiding it behind my back, asking the question, having him answer, and then I'd hold up the sign. In any case, static electricity was the fun thing for those days. Nowadays, it's paleontology. Then it was static electricity. People tried to get all sorts of things electrified. And one guy at the University of Leiden managed to take a jar which was lined with metal, with a little water in it, all sorts of things. And he found out that it really picked up an enormous charge, so that when it discharged, it knocked him down. His name was Muschenbroek. And he said he wouldn't take another discharge like that to be the King of France. And the King of France in those days was a big thing. It was called the Leyden jar, and everybody experimented with Leyden jars, including Ben Franklin. And he noticed, as everyone else did, that when it discharged, there was a little flash of light, a little spark, and a little crackle. For all the world, as though it were a micro-miniaturized lightning and thunder. And it occurred to Franklin that maybe everyone was looking at it the wrong way around. This is always helpful in science. If things are puzzling, sometimes you try to stand it on its head and see if it makes more sense that way. It's also important in plotting stories. If you get stuck, maybe you're looking at it from the wrong direction. Try the other direction. At any rate, Franklin said to himself, maybe it isn't that the Leyden jar discharge is a micro-miniaturized lightning and thunder. Maybe lightning and thunder is an unimaginably enormous Leyden jar discharge. And this was not just speculation, because it could be tested. And Franklin knew how to test it too, though I tell you it was a dangerous way. And the way to do that was to charge a lightning jar from the huge lightning jar in the heavens. And if he could do that, then he would see that the comparison between the two, the man-made lightning jar and the tremendous conflict between earth and sky, would really have something to it. And so the question was, how was he going to get something up into the clouds from which he could charge a Leyden jar? And the only way you could do it in those days, this was 1752, was by means of a kite. So he flew a kite. And today, something that Benjamin Franklin doesn't realize, most people remember him only as being queer for flying kites. He waited until there was a thunderstorm coming up, and then he flew his kite. However, he was a sensible person. He didn't fly it just for fun. He didn't go out where he was going to get wet. He stayed under a shed. And what's more, he didn't hold the cord of the kite. He was too smart for that. He tied a thread of silk, which was known to be an insulator, and he held the silk. That's what saved his life. The next guy who tried it was killed, honestly. He tried it in Russia, didn't take the proper precautions, and he was killed. However, Benjamin Franklin wasn't. And he waited. The kite went into a cloud, and then he could see the strands of the cord that held the kite begin to separate, as though they were repelling each other, which made him decide that they were electrically charged. And at the bottom there was a key, a metal key. And this was the difficult part. He advanced his knuckle to the key to see if he would get a discharge. And he did. And I'm sure he said, ouch. And that was good. He next brought in the Leyden jar and touched it to the key, and it was charged. And once it was charged, the Leyden jar acted just as though he had charged it himself from some earthly source, from rubbing something and getting it electrified. So he proved quite adequately, once and for all, that the electricity represented by lightning was precisely the same as the electricity that people were fooling around with in the laboratory. And now, what could he do with that? Because Benjamin Franklin, above all, was a practical man. He had experimented with Leyden jars, and he found that it was very difficult to get a discharge if he made the metal object sticking out of the Leyden jar from which the discharge was discharged, if he made it pointy instead of blunt. The more pointy he made it, the more difficult it was to discharge it. And the reason was that the electrification leaked out of the point readily, so that he couldn't manage to get the Leyden jar sufficiently electrified to let go of it all at once. If you had a blunt end, then you electrified it until it was so electrified that it forced its way out through the air, and you got a large discharge complete with flash and crackle. If you had the point, it just leaked out practically as fast as you pumped the electricity in, and you never got the discharge. Well, says Benjamin Franklin, if lightning is an expression of electricity just like a Leyden jar, if you could attach a sharp point to a building somehow and ground it properly, then any accumulation of static electricity on the building would leak off as fast as it built up, and there would never be any lightning bolts striking it. So the next year, in his Poor Richard's Almanac, he announced this infallible method of protecting buildings from lightning. And since it was very simple to do and didn't take much of a capital investment, what could you lose, everyone said? They started putting up lightning rods, as they called them, in Philadelphia, then in Boston, then in other places, then in Europe, as they heard it. And who was offended by this? Why, a number of the more fundamentalist divines were offended by this. One of the reasons that they were offended was that this was an attempt to avoid God's just punishment. I mean, it was an attempt to avoid a catastrophe which was being visited on humanity because they deserved it. And how dare you do anything to prevent yourself from being punished for the good of your soul? The same argument can be used against using umbrellas when it rains, because if God means you to be wet, how dare you try to be dry? Or wearing overcoats when it's cold, or ducking when something comes at you. Besides, my feeling is that arguments of this sort, that lightning was meant to hit you and you shouldn't try to avoid it, arguments of this sort are blasphemous, because implies that God is so easily foiled. I mean, if I were God and I wanted to hit someone with lightning, or destroy his barn just because I felt he deserved it, and he put up a lightning rod, I'd send that lightning around it. In 1755, just a couple of years after lightning rods became fashionable, an earthquake just off the shores of Portugal destroyed the city of Lisbon. It was followed by a tidal wave, a tsunami, which completed the job. All of southern Europe and northern Africa was shaken up and bounced quite badly, but Lisbon was the thing that people noticed most, at least Europeans did, because for one thing, it was in Europe. It was a Christian city. Over in Morocco, they were Muslims. And and you can understand why God would... Anyway, there is a record that there were Boston ministers who got up in their pulpits and explained that the reason Lisbon was destroyed was because Boston was using lightning rods and getting God mad. Now, presumably, he aimed at Boston and hit Lisbon, which was, I think, the first advancement of the God is blind theory. Well, now, we've got to understand the peculiarity about lightning bolts. In general, although I suppose the people of the time didn't bother to try to analyze the data, in general, it tends to hit the tallest point in a town. You know, if you've got a town with a bunch of buildings, the buildings that sticks up the most is the one most likely to be struck by lightning. God knows how many times the Empire State is struck by lightning. Well, which is the building in 18th century and prior towns in Europe which sticks up the highest? It happens to be the church steeple in every case. Which means that church steeples got hit an awful lot, which no one could properly explain, so everybody ignored. Now, what was the method used to avoid lightning bolts in those days? It wasn't lightning rods, which were just man's interference. You did it the right way. You appealed to God. And you appealed to God by ringing the church bells. You figured he might not hear your voice over the lightning and the thunder and the splashing of but the bells he would hear. So they would send people up into the steeples to ring the bells. The number of bell ringers who were killed by lightning was enormous, really. There were hundreds. Which could only be explained by assuming they were drawn from a peculiarly sinful portion of the population. Now came the big question. And it was, were churches going to take advantage of lightning rods to protect themselves from the just wrath of God? And for a long time, they didn't, because it would have been an admission that they had to depend on fallible human science to protect themselves when the only proper way was by contrition and remorse and pleading and begging and all that. So there was a church in Italy, which was, of course, the tallest church in its building. I think it was in the city of Novara, but I can't swear to it. It's been a long time since I looked up the data. I should have looked it up now, but I didn't know I was going to talk about this. Pardon me? No, it wasn't Venice. And they had a mess of gunpowder in town because you needed it in those days in case you had to defend yourself against an invading enemy. And where was a good, safe place for the gunpowder? In the basement of the church, obviously. So they did. They put a whole lot of gunpowder in the basement of the church. This was somewhere in the 1770s or so. And lightning hit the church. And the gunpowder went up, boom, and destroyed 1/6 of the city and rather more than 1/6 of the population. And after that, lightning rods went up on all the churches. And people had visual evidence that A, lightning wasn't a visitation by God, that you couldn't get out of it by praying to him, and that you could get out of it by using the principles of science. It was the first victory of science over big brotherism. And it was a turning point because everyone with their own eyes could see where safety lay, if it lay anywhere. And it wasn't in groveling and pleading and praying and begging. It was in making use of reason, which, if you wish, you can say that God gave us. And God gave us the ability to reason and the power to make observations so that we could use them, not just to fool around with. And I've always thought of 1752 as an important well, always, since I figured this out. I've thought of 1752 as an important turning point in the cultural history of humanity, and one that is ignored by almost everybody. And it makes me good to think of that. And to think also that in 1798, a generation later, when they first worked out the principle of vaccination against smallpox, the incidence of smallpox began to drop instantly. Within a matter of a couple of decades, it had gone down to 1/3 of what it was before. And it was adopted everywhere in Europe without question. And I don't know of any minister who had the infernal gall to stand up and say that this was interfering with God's plan, that people should be willing to have smallpox rather than stop it by anything purely man-made. You couldn't, maybe lightning. There were so few lightning strokes that people might be philosophic about it. But smallpox was a deadly danger that scared everyone. And nobody was going to be told they ought to risk it rather than interfere with the dictates of God. Which shows that Big Brother isn't as all-powerful as you think. You can protect yourself against him. And there's only one way, and that's through the power of human reason. But you know, Big Brother isn't the only one who watches. He's got a host of millions of little brothers who all take on the job of watching you for him. I know, because I write for various publications, and I have the bad habit of saying what I think, and the older I get, the less scared I am. So I say more and more clearly what I think, and so I get letters. And frequently the letters are from kindly religious people who condemn me to eternal torments in hell. I always figure, why are they worried? Isn't it enough that I'm going to be submitted to torture forever and ever and ever and ever? Do they want to also bother me with nasty letters too? I got a letter once from a woman who started off, "Dear Dr. Asimov," and it went downhill from there. Because the first sentence was, "In biblical parlance, you are a fool." And I knew what she meant. I had written an article for a magazine called True. And in it, somehow, I had gotten across the idea that if we were going to be saved as a civilization, maybe even as a life form, we were going to have to depend upon our own reason. I say, we could sit back and let God save us, but just in case we're not sure that he might want to save us, or that he's there, maybe it'd be just as well to try to use our own abilities. If he intends to save us, we haven't lost anything. And if he doesn't intend to, that may be the way we'll be saved. So by reasoning it out in this fashion, she decided I didn't believe in God, and therefore she called me a fool, because there are 2 Psalms in the Bible. It got included twice by mistake, except that, of course, biblical writers who are inspired by God don't make mistakes. So if you left out one of those Psalms as being just a repetition, it would instantly invalidate the entire Bible, which would be therefore burned as the devil's work. But it starts off, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." And she went on in a 2-page letter to elaborate on this thesis. So, my policy always is to turn the other cheek and to return good for evil and to be sweet and nice and kind. I didn't call her any names. I sent her back a postcard. I always use a postcard so that anyone can read it, you see. And also it encourages me to be brief. And I said, "Dear Mrs. So-and-so, whosoever shall call another Whoever shall say to his brother, thou fool, shall stand in danger of hellfire. Matthew 6:5. I mean, I didn't say it. I was quoting from the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said it. I got back a 7-page letter. Absolutely furious. I mean, there's no one who can get as furious as a Bible lover who has the Bible quoted at them. Explaining that even though Jesus had personally told her not to call me a fool, she was going to do it anyway. So I sent back a postcard with the rest of the verse. And he who is angry with his brother without cause shall stand in danger of the judgment. Matthew 6:5. Never got an answer. Well, one theory is she's still writing. But what scares me is that she might have had an apoplectic stroke where she got... I mean, I don't want to cause anyone's death. But I get lots of letters, and sometimes I get some which are very shrewd in a transparent sort of way. And this increased after I started writing articles against creationism, because I have received a lot of letters from convinced creationists. Some of them are sorry for me and send me literature which they think maybe I haven't seen and which will convince me that creationism is correct. Oh, have they got a chance? And others yell at me. But some try strategy. And one of the pieces of strategy which I find cute is to pretend you're an evolutionist and that you're puzzled by some of the excellent points brought up by the creationists, and you don't know how to answer them. Please help me, Dr. Asimov, and tell me how to answer them, because the poor souls really think I'm going to get involved in long correspondence with them, and they also think I'm not going to be able to answer them, and they're going to humiliate me, because I'm going to have to write to them and say, gee, I don't see how that's possible. Maybe the creationists are right, you know? And then they'll show it to everybody, see? But they always make a mistake because they overplay their own evolutionaryism. You know, I get letters from someone who says he's always been an evolutionist. Ever since he was a little boy, he's been an evolutionist. It never occurred to him there was anything else. Evolutionism was his life. You know, they don't understand. They know how people become creationists. They know that little kids, when they're 3 years old, are taught to put their hands together and say, now I lay me down to sleep. And they're given all sorts of little stories from the Bible and Sunday school. And they grow up, but while their minds are still childish and dim, they learn about all this. And by the time they get to the point where presumably they have the power of reason, they can't remember when they didn't believe in God and the Bible and all the rest of the stuff. And so they assume that evolutionists must be the same way. For instance, Dr. Asimov, when he was 3 years old, was taught by his parents to put his hands together and say, and may Charles Darwin bless Mommy and Poppy and all that. So that I grew up never knowing anything except that the Origin of Species was a sacred book that you mustn't question. So I know right off. The guy knows nothing about evolution. He certainly knows nothing about science, and he is a creator. And then he has those list of questions. So what I do is I assume, as far as he's concerned, I'm going to accept his word. He's an evolutionist, that he teaches science at a high school, and that he's stumped by these questions. And I say, I'm glad that you're doing your best to teach youngsters about evolution. And now let's consider the questions. I have no room to answer them all. I'll pick out one of them. And I pick out one of that I can handle in a postcard. And for instance, the one I remember most was point number 5. There is salt coming into the ocean from the rivers. to an extent that would make the oceans as salty as they are now in 10,000 years. So if Earth existed for billions of years, wouldn't the ocean be far more salty than it is? Doesn't the saltiness of the ocean show that the Earth has only existed for a small length of time? Well, first place, I don't know his figures. I'm not going to check them. I doubt him very much, but let's accept them. What I say is, to answer that one point, consider that every time I comb my hair, there are a number of hairs that appear in the comb, which I then discard. I only have a finite number of hairs on my head, and I can easily calculate that considering how many come out each time I comb it, I should be completely bald in about 10 years. And yet I've been doing this now for 60 years, and I still have a full head of hair. How is that possible? The answer is that new hair grows as old hair comes out. So I keep my head of hair. In the same way, admittedly, salt comes into the ocean, but salt also leaves the ocean in various ways. For instance, shallow arms of the ocean dry up. Where do you think all the salt mines come from? All that salt was once in the ocean. It isn't anymore. And that's why the ocean is no more salty than it is. And having finished it, I say, this is an example of the complete stupidity of the creationist viewpoint. All the other points are equally stupid, except where the creationists are outrightly lying. So I want you to tell your classes, because you can see how you can figure out answers, tell them that the creationists are stupid, lying people who are not to be trusted in any way. And I send it off. He can't show that postcard to anybody. I have a lot of fun. Janet, my dear wife, was sitting in the back row there. She reads my postcards every once in a while, and she complains. She says, "Do you keep copies of these?" I say, "No, the whole point of sending a postcard is I don't waste time. If I make a copy, I might as well write a letter already." She gets mad. She wants me, A, to save the postcards because she thinks they're works of literature, and B, not to send them because she thinks someone's going to get so furious they'll come after me with a knife or something. She's torn. This is called ambivalence. Anyway, the point is that the fight is a hard one. It's got to be hard. We're always going to be a minority because there is, in a sense, only one set of things that are so. There's only one way of correctly interpreting the universe. This is not to say we have it. We keep making a closer and closer approach all the time, I think. We will never understand it all, which is a good thing. The game would stop being fun if we had all the answers. And that it's the pursuit that's the fun. But there are an infinite number of ways of being wrong about the universe. And what's more, all the ways of being wrong about the universe are more consoling than the way of being right. Because unfortunately, to be right about the universe is very likely to end up with a decision that the universe doesn't give a damn about us. And that a great many things that happen, if not everything that happens, is largely random. And that we're being asked, in order to maximize our security, to understand all these rather subtle, random things in the universe, and not to find consolation in a belief that someone or something is taking care of us. Whereas, on the other hand, all the false views, all the manifestly stupid views that we fight, all involve either the fact that someone is taking care of us, so we don't have to do any thinking, we don't have to do any trying, we don't have to work, all we have to do is be good and beg a lot, and that'll take care of us. Or else that there are easy ways of preventing misfortune. All you have to do is read the stars or study the entrails of a beast or look at the way the birds are flying or read the palm of your hand or play with cards, and that'll tell you what's going to happen to you. You will meet a dark lady. You will take a long voyage. This is not the kind of day to invest in stocks and all that. And then you can sort of avoid these things, especially if you're careful not to let black cats cross your path and you don't light three in a match and you keep your lucky stones. I have a lucky stone here somewhere. I think it's in my other jacket pocket. And stuff like that. You can run through the universe without fail if you know all these things. Why bother thinking? So if you think you're going to persuade everybody to sit on that cold mountaintop with you and try to bundle up against that uncaring blast, you're kidding yourself. Then why are we trying? For the same reason we're trying to understand the universe. Because we've got the brains and the will to do so, and would be disgraceful if we didn't use it. The fact that someone might argue we can't win doesn't mean a darn thing. The victory does not lie in the winning. The victory over ourselves lies in the trying. We owe it to ourselves as human beings, as respectable human beings, as thinking human beings, to do what we can to make humanity rational. And having done this, or having tried to do this, we can respect ourselves. And that's what I'm in it for, so that I needn't be ashamed of myself. And that's why I'm glad I've got a Humanist of the Year. It probably is going to mean very little to most people, except that it'll inspire them to write me more letters. But it means a heck of a lot to me. It means that I'm a success in my own eyes. And it's in my own eyes that the only success counts. Thank you very much.